Forget everything your history textbook told you about where Filipino civilization began. Not because it was wrong, because it was incomplete, dangerously, deliberately incomplete. There's a name most Filipinos have never heard, a group of people who shaped your language, your farming traditions, your blood, and then got erased from the official story. Not by accident, but by the slow, grinding machinery of colonial record-keeping that decided certain ancestors weren't worth remembering. Geneticists working out of ancient DNA labs in Europe and Southeast Asia just changed that. What they found in the bones doesn't match what Beijing has been saying for decades. And the difference matters more than you think. Stay with this, because the story starts underground, literally. Deep in the limestone caves of Palawan, archaeologists once pulled skeletal remains from the earth and called them early Southeast Asian migrants. Generic, forgettable, a footnote. Those remains sat in storage for years, while bigger, louder discoveries grabbed headlines elsewhere. Nobody thought to look closer. Then a team of researchers ran the ancient DNA. What came back stopped the lab cold. The genetic signature didn't fit the standard migration model. It wasn't Proto-Malay. It wasn't the neat southward wave from southern China that textbooks love to draw, with clean arrows on clean maps. It was something older, something that had been sitting in island Southeast Asia for thousands of years before any agricultural expansion moved down from the mainland, before rice paddies, before dynasty names, before anyone in the Pearl River Delta decided to start calling the ocean their own. Those bones belonged to people who were already home. Stop. The researchers cross-referenced the data with living populations across the Philippine archipelago, particularly groups in Mindanao and the Visayas who had been classified incorrectly as later arrivals. The genetic overlap was enormous. These weren't newcomers blending in. These were the original architects of the population, and the connection ran continuous, unbroken, from those Palawan Caves straight into modern Filipino DNA. That's not a migration story. That's a root story. Now, here's where the theft begins, and it begins not with soldiers or ships. It begins with a word. Look, the word is Nusantara. You may have heard it recently because Indonesia adopted it as the name for its new capital. Sounds like a grand ancient term full of regional solidarity. Except for centuries, Chinese imperial records used their own vocabulary to describe the maritime world of island Southeast Asia. They wrote about it as peripheral, tributary, dependent on the benevolence of the Middle Kingdom to function. Filipino trade networks, the gold work of pre-colonial chiefs, the sophisticated inter-island diplomacy, all of it got flattened in Chinese chronicles into a simple story. The islands sent tribute, and the mainland sent civilization. That framing stuck. It infected Western colonial scholarship. It shaped how Spanish missionaries wrote about the people they were converting. It echoed through American-era education policy. And it created a mental architecture that many Filipinos still live inside, the unconscious belief that everything important came from somewhere else first. By the way, the geneticists didn't just find bones. They found a counter-argument written in adenine and guanine. Think about the Austronesian expansion for a moment. This is the greatest maritime migration in human history. People spread from Taiwan across the Pacific to Madagascar, a geographic reach that dwarfs any Viking voyage, any Silk Road caravan. The ancestors of Filipinos were not passengers on that journey. They were the sailors. They were the navigators. They built the boats. They taught their children to read stars and currents before writing systems existed anywhere nearby. Wait a second. That knowledge didn't come from China. And yet, look at what happened to the material evidence of that knowledge. The Manila Galleon era brought Spanish colonizers who needed a controllable, legible history. They wrote the pre-colonial world as chaos interrupted by salvation. Meanwhile, Chinese traders who had worked alongside Filipino communities for generations, trading porcelain for gold, silk for beeswax, got rewritten in the colonial imagination as civilizers rather than commerce partners. The relationship flipped. Filipinos became the recipients of culture rather than participants in its creation. Here's the thread that holds this all together. A few years ago, a separate genetic study focused specifically on the Sama Bajau, the sea nomads of the Sulu archipelago who spend more of their lives on water than on land. The study found something extraordinary in their genome, a genetic adaptation for diving, a specific variant in the PDE10A gene that correlates with larger spleens. Larger spleens store more oxygenated red blood cells. The Sama Bajau can dive to depths and hold breath durations that should not be physiologically possible for an untrained person. This adaptation takes generations to develop. We're talking about thousands of years of selective pressure from a maritime lifestyle, so intense that it rewrote their biology. That's not a people who learned to fish from a neighboring civilization. That's a people who were born from the sea itself. And that's what the new ancient DNA work connects to, really connects. The Palawan remains share genetic markers with populations across the archipelago, including ancestral links to the Sama Bajau lineage. The sea people didn't arrive late. They were always there. The ocean was theirs before any external power decided to draw a dotted line through it on a map and call it a territorial claim. Stop. Breathe. Because here's where the modern stakes get sharp. China's 9-dash line. You know the name. You've seen the map. The claim stretches deep into Philippine waters, and the justification Beijing offers, when it bothers to offer one, leans on historical presence, ancient voyages, old charts, the suggestion that because Chinese merchants sailed those waters have a Chinese story. But ancient DNA doesn't care about merchant routes. Ancient DNA cares about who lived there, who built there, who buried their dead in that earth and left their biology in the soil. And what the labs are showing consistently across multiple studies from different research institutions is that the people who were genetically continuous in the Philippine archipelago were not migrants from the Chinese mainland. They were a distinct population with their own deep roots, their own ancient adaptations, their own civilization that was trading with China, not dependent on it. The difference between trading partner and dependent is enormous. Empires have been justified on smaller misreadings than that. Here's the piece that doesn't get talked about. The archaeologists who uncovered the Palawan remains weren't famous. They weren't headlining international conferences. They were Filipino researchers working with limited equipment, in difficult conditions, in caves that weren't exactly designed for fieldwork. The names attached to those early excavations are mostly unknown outside specialist journals. But their work, their patience, their careful labeling of fragments that could have been dismissed as too incomplete to matter, created the physical record that later ancient DNA researchers used. There's a catch: the invisible hands again. The people in the background who made the discovery possible without getting credit for the discovery. This pattern runs through Philippine history like a seam of gold through limestone. The people who did the foundational work get compressed into a footnote, while the person who arrived later with better funding and a university affiliation gets the headline. It happened in archaeology. It happened in colonial history. It's happening right now in how the genetic findings are being reported internationally, framed as a Western or Taiwanese scientific achievement rather than a confirmation of what Filipino oral traditions and indigenous knowledge systems have been saying for a very long time. Your Lola knew. She just didn't have a journal citation. Now here's the detail that the mainstream coverage missed entirely. And this is where the story gets genuinely strange. When researchers compared the ancient Palawan DNA with reference populations across Southeast Asia, they found a signal they weren't expecting. A genetic cluster that showed stronger affinity with populations in eastern Indonesia and parts of Melanesia than with any population on the Chinese mainland, even after controlling for later migration events. This doesn't mean Filipino ancestors came from Melanesia. It means the genetic picture of who was in this region first is far more complex, far more ancient, and far less China-centric than anyone had published before. The standard model had been built on linguistics and pottery. The new model is built on biology, and biology is harder to politically reinterpret than a ceramic shard. There's one more layer. And this one requires following a thread that goes somewhere unexpected. Interesting fact, the gold artifacts recovered from pre-colonial Philippine sites, the jewelry, the funeral masks, the intricately worked pieces that now sit in museums in Manila and Madrid, were analyzed for their metallurgical signatures. The techniques used weren't imported. They weren't derivative of Chinese goldwork or Indian influence. They were locally developed, independent. Some researchers believe the Philippine goldworking tradition was among the most sophisticated in the region during its peak period. Where did that knowledge come from? Not from a tributary relationship, from people who had been refining the skill for generations in a place they considered home. People who didn't think of themselves as peripheral to a greater civilization. Because from where they stood, they were the civilization. Now pay attention. The genetic evidence and the material culture evidence are pointing in the same direction now. And the direction is, the Philippines wasn't a blank space that foreign contact filled with meaning. It was a world with its own logic, its own complexity, its own inherited genius, before any outside power arrived to take credit for the furniture. But here's what no study has fully resolved yet. Here's the open question that 3 separate research teams are currently working on, and what they find will either confirm the current model or break it apart completely. There's a gap, a genetic gap between the ancient Palawan population and certain modern Philippine groups that hasn't been explained by any migration event in the current record. Something happened between approximately 4,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago that shifted the genetic composition in ways that don't match the simple Austronesian expansion replaces earlier inhabitants' story. Something moved through the archipelago. Something left a mark that researchers can measure but not yet name. One team thinks it was a population that left almost no archaeological footprint, no pottery, no structures, just movement and genetics, and then silence. Who were they? Where did they come from? And why does their genetic signal cluster most strongly in communities living on the slopes of specific mountains in Mindanao and the northern Cordillera? Communities that have maintained distinct cultural practices that don't fit neatly into any colonial-era ethnic classification system? That question is still open. The data is still coming in. And when the answer arrives, if the pattern holds, it won't just rewrite Filipino prehistory. It will rewrite the entire story of how humans moved through island Southeast Asia. Your ancestors built something extraordinary. The proof is in the earth, in the bones, in the biology that you carry right now. The story isn't finished. Not even close.